The sound of a metal detector going off may be the last port of help for a young person trying to escape a forced marriage. Charity Karma Nirvana is asking youngsters who are being taken abroad to be forcefully married off over the summer to hide spoons in their underwear. This seemingly bizarre step could help them alert airport authorities about their situation and possibly save them from a future that many describe as riddled with coercion, abuse, and torture. But this technique may help if the person knows they're going to be forcefully married. Many times they are unaware of the true objective of the trip. Alexander Khan recounts one such so-called vacation to Pakistan that he was asked to go on about 20 years back.
I jumped at the chance. I thought, fantastic. Going back to this country where, the sky's always blue and, the fields, everything's really in the open. So I was really excited. 2-3 weeks into my so-called holiday, I was walking up one morning. I was given some new clothes. I was given some new sandals that boys and men wear in that part of the country. And I was given a brand new shawl. And I was told to sit beside a girl who was around the age of 9. Unbeknown to me, this was an arranged marriage. My step-family in England had arranged this with a family in Pakistan. So there I was in this country with my family, sat beside this girl who was 9 years old, and it was an engagement party, and obviously I wasn't aware of this. There was music playing and there was necklaces, huge necklaces with rupees on there and patterns, and that was put over my head and my shoulders, but I just went along with it. I was not aware of what was happening at the time.
Born to a Pakistani father and an English mother, Alexander Khan's dad died when he was just 10. He was subsequently separated from his mother and taken in by his uncle. After his engagement, Alexander came to England and 3 years later was asked by his step-family to go back to Pakistan to marry the girl. In exchange for the wedding, the girl's family had given Alexander's step-family a sum of £3,000 and some land in Pakistan. Things turned ugly when he protested.
It came to this day where they said, look, we need to make arrangements, we need to start booking the flights, we need to get you to Pakistan, you will marry this girl, you will bring her back to this country. One evening I just frankly turned around and said no. The uncle and some of the cousins actually pinned me down to the ground, and he was just punching me on my shoulders, on my back, on my arms, not on my face because that would be quite visible. And they put a lot of force on me, a lot of pressure for me to go ahead with this. Now, it was then that I realised that I had to get out of this arrangement.
Alexander left the family and joined the British Army to escape. His case is not an isolated one. Statistics from the Forced Marriage Unit indicate that London reports the highest number of forced marriages in UK. Over 1/5 of reported cases in 2012 were from London. The West Midlands followed closely behind.
Page 51. When I was a child, he would sit me on his knee and tell me that wives, sisters and daughters were like precious glass vases within which a man's honour was contained. These glass vases must never be broken.
Sufia Ahmad is the author of Secrets of the Henna Girl, a story based on forced marriages. She used to work in the parliament, and it was there that she met a group of women who were campaigning for action to be taken against forced marriage. Sufia welcomes the criminalisation and, like many others I spoke to, believes forced marriages and so-called honour-related crimes are not about religion but more about tradition. To validate her point, she also read out a quote from the Quran.
Obtain the virgin's consent before you marry her. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's hadith.
As an Asian Muslim woman brought up in Britain, she had seen cases around her. While the issue was a topic of conversation of many middle-class dinner parties, Sophia feels the hesitation to get involved in the affairs of other families prevented people from taking strong action.
Well, when I was 14, one of my friends didn't come to school on the first day of term. And, in the summer holiday, she was taken abroad and she was married off. And I remember thinking, oh, that's tough for her. But I didn't really think about it because, again, I thought what society thought, which was that, if that's how her family do things and that's how their family do things. And I only really changed that whole mindset in my own mind when I met those women in Parliament. Because when they were talking about what they'd been through, that's when I actually thought, oh my gosh, maybe my friend went through the same thing. We just never thought about her. We just thought, oh, it's her family and that's how they do things. So because we never had it in my family, my extended family, or my community even, you just don't think about it until you realise, until someone describes actually what they go through.
Forced marriages are often associated with so-called honor-based abuse. PhD researcher at Cardiff University, Joan Payton, also works for the Iranian Kurdish women's rights organisation.
There is a very, very big intersection between forced marriage and honour-based violence. You kind of find forced marriage being used as a form of honour-based violence in the sense of reputation management, that the family's looking bad, but if they force this girl into marriage, it looks like they've regained control. And then you get honour-based violence because someone won't agree to a forced marriage. So there's really quite a big intersection.
Abuse involved can be emotional, physical, or sexual. The worst-case scenario is murder. Cases can get really bad.
Some of these stories are really unbelievable, including one woman who escaped a potential honour killing back at home by three of her brothers and came to the UK and then nearly got another honour killing from her uncle. So she escaped 2 honour killings in her life. And this uncle was so determined to trace her down, she needed to change her address 13 times in less than 12 months because he kept finding her.
I have had a case where a child was sexually harmed by a maternal uncle because he didn't like the way she was dressed or didn't believe that she was living a westernised lifestyle and she wanted to pursue her education. So that was a way of him controlling her. You tend to find children who are suffering severe emotional harm because of the duress that they're under and the emotional blackmail that they'll feel from their families. So it tends to be those children who are suffering from emotional harm and possibly physical harm and sexual harm.
Monica Bindle is a children's solicitor for Birmingham City Council's legal services. Last year, the Forced Marriage Unit handled cases that involved over 60 countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, Morocco, and Ukraine. Monica says anyone can be a victim.
It's not stereotyping, it's just unfortunate that most of the cases that do come through Birmingham County Court have been from the South Asian families. But that's not to say it doesn't happen, because we've had cases where children subject to forced marriage protection orders who are from countries in Africa, so Somalia, you're looking at Romania as well. So that you can't just categorise that forced marriage will never happen to anyone, because it can happen to anyone. I understand that those from the police in Devon, that a lot of their forced marriage protection orders are taken out on the Irish travelling community. So you can't generalise and say, oh, in Asian communities it only happens there. That's just not true. It's just unfortunate that it comes across like that because of the applications and who the victims are in Birmingham seem to be predominantly Asian.
Joan Payton warns against ethnicising the issue.
There's been a tendency for people to say that this is a South Asian issue or this is a Middle Eastern issue. But I think there's very real dangers in ethnicising the crime in this way. Quite apart from increasing negative perceptions of minorities, it can lead to quite serious misrecognitions. I can think of a case recently where 2 girls went to help for a police officer because they were at risk of forced marriage, and he just refused to believe them because they didn't look ethnic enough, if you know what I'm saying. They looked Western. And there are other communities as well. I know ICRO certainly has worked with women from Eastern Europe who've been forced into marriage. And if they're going to ethnicize this model, they're going to miss so many cases, and that could be really hazardous.
The present legal remedy is a civil one, which enables the court to make a forced marriage protection order, or FMPO, to protect someone who is being forced into a marriage or is already in a forced marriage.
An FMPO can be taken by the person to be protected, the victim themselves, or even someone on their behalf, like the social services, the police, or another family member. The terms of the order could include preventing a forced marriage from occurring, handing over of passports, stopping violence or intimidation, revealing the whereabouts of a person, or even preventing someone from being taken abroad. The breach of an FMPO is dealt with as contempt of court.
I think the Forced Marriage Protection Act is a very useful tool, but I just don't think it goes far enough. Where somebody is forced into marriage, they suffer domestic abuse, they suffer often a life of slavery, being serially raped, often being kidnapped, being isolated, being tortured. Ultimately, it can lead to murder. To have a criminal offence that says forced marriage is wrong and against the law is a natural progression, is the right step for a country that values human rights, which we do in this country.
Anita Prem is the founder of Freedom Charity. The charity launched the first ever 24-hour forced marriage helpline in the country and also introduced a forced marriage app that can be downloaded on the phone.
Ultimately, it leads to murder. Young people commit suicide. I don't know how much worse it needs to get, You've got people with disabilities that are forced into marriage, which means they're then raped. These are awful crimes, and I think we need to take them very seriously. It's a human rights issue, and it's a violation of our liberties.
The UK government has decided that despite the phenomenal work that we've been doing over the last decade in improving the services to victims and survivors, that further legislation is required in order to give victims and potential victims of the future the tools they need to keep themselves safe. And one of those tools is the ability to call upon the police to investigate where they have been threatened with a forced marriage or whether they have been forced into a forced marriage, in order for them to get safety and also for the perpetrators to be brought to justice.
Nazir Afzal OBE is the Chief Crown Prosecutor for CPS Northwest. In 2012-13, the Crown Prosecution Service handled about 200 cases of honour abuse and 32 cases of forced marriage nationally. Cases can get very complicated. These are organised crimes and hitmen could be involved. Nazir Afzal finds that breaking down the so-called wall of silence is the biggest difficulty while handling such cases.
We treat these crimes as organised crimes. That's why, to date, we have not simply placed it within our domestic abuse agenda. We recognise that families or communities or groups of people get together to carry out this behaviour. And so we have to break down that wall of silence. And once you do that, you have the evidence, and for us to collect the evidence, or for the police to collect the evidence, requires a significant amount of planning, sometimes the use of covert techniques. Very often it requires tremendous courage on the part of witnesses to come forward and tell us what they know. So we have to break that wall of silence. We have to offer all manner of protection and support for victims and witnesses in order to build very strong cases. We've got to recognise that there are very often more than one person who's the perpetrator. We also have to recognise that there may well be more than one victim. So it is a steady case-building process which requires a great deal of planning, as I said, and significant effort in order to collect the evidence.
While many NGOs and activists have been campaigning for criminalisation of forced marriages, there are some who believe it could drive the issue underground. They feel people being coerced into marriage may hesitate from complaining against their own families, who are often the perpetrators. Lord Nazir Ahmad from the British House of Lords thinks criminalisation has its own disadvantages.
On a first thought, I don't think this will help, because already we are talking about forced marriage being unacceptable in any society. I think if you criminalize it, that means that less people will report it, because young men and women do not want to see their parents going into prison. And it would be very difficult to prosecute parents, because you see, forced marriage is very much a kind of a judgment of where the emotional blackmail and pressure, sort of family pressure, and then physical pressure, and then mental pressure, and kind of mental torture, and then which goes into physical violence, and perhaps even some in horrible cases where people are then killed as well. But I think it would be difficult, so I cannot support it as it is.
In Alexander's case, he felt he was brought up in such an isolated community that he had little contact with anyone outside, and so the idea of going to the police never even crossed his mind. But this was about 2 decades ago. Presently, how do the police fit into the picture? Jerry Campbell is UK's Deputy National Lead for Honour-Based Violence, Forced Marriage and Female Genital Mutilation for the Association of Chief Police Officers, commonly known as ACPO. He says that it's paramount that no one will ever or should ever be turned away when approaching the police for help, as the first priority is to always ensure their safety. Thereafter, the person is referred to a culturally sensitive service.
Now, we do know that the vast majority of victims, for a whole number of reasons, don't want to have the mums, the dads, the brothers, the sisters, and other close family members who might be involved. They don't want to prosecute them. They don't want to, for example, for some, demonise their religion or the culture for fear of how that might be portrayed by others, including the media. So we work with that victim. We will work with them, with the culturally sensitive NGOs, to ensure that we provide a bespoke service to keep them safe, to provide reassurance, advice, guidance and support. And the longer term picture for us is to maintain their safety, but also it is to allow that person, that young person in the main, the freedom to make choice, to allow them to develop in a way that allows them to realise their full potential.
Ensuring that victims realise the risks that they face is the biggest challenge for the police. Jerry Campbell again.
Time and again, some victims perhaps don't realise or don't want to realise the level of danger and risk that they face. But what we don't want to do is make decisions and choices on behalf of those victims, because otherwise we will replace the power and control agent, will shift from parents to law enforcement or to social workers. We want to arm that person with sufficient information to make and be part of decision making that keeps them safe, that allows them to develop and go on to realise their full potential. So that is an absolute challenge for us.
I think it's about trust and confidence. So if someone's erring on the side and feeling the pressure, directly or indirectly, of honour-based violence, they should be in no doubt whatsoever that they can go to the police. And I suspect some people, particularly young people, irrespective of background, probably lack that confidence and faith in policing, either to deal with the issue or secondly to protect them once they've raised the issue. So I think it's more about the police convincing the broader public that they are an organisation that can be trusted, that they can be approached, and that appropriate responses for whatever report is made to the police will be given to the public.
Nick Howe was a police chief superintendent in the Staffordshire Police for over 30 years. He's now a professor of criminology at the University of Derby. He notes the change in the method of gathering evidence for so-called honour-based violence and forced marriages.
It often goes beyond the victim themselves, because the victims talk to people. So there's often other people who can corroborate the distress, the anxiety, and some of the conversations. The use of technology nowadays, of course, young people in particular, texts, emails, that provides a whole chronology of audit trail of sometimes anguish and anxiety, but can constitute evidence. And it's often now, dare I say, through technology that often beyond just the word, people are more alive to collecting their own evidence in digital ways that sometimes can be compelling and allow juries and judges to convict. So I think the world is changing for the nature of the way that evidence is presented to the police, other than just verbal accounts.
Saving a person from a forced marriage is just half the battle. The next challenge is rehabilitation of survivors. Joanne Payton suggests this is still a grey area.
I would say that, from my experience, every single survivor of honour-based violence has post-traumatic stress disorder, and almost all forced marriage survivors have got some kind of depression and maybe post-traumatic stress disorder as well. The counselling that's needed for this is, really quite prolonged and much beyond what's offered on the NHS. And there's also a real shortfall of counsellors who are able to speak languages other than English to help people who don't speak English. The other thing is to help women to rebuild networks. If it's really the case that they can't reconcile with their families, what we need to do is encourage friendship networks, social capital networks, to help them find support from each other.
I did my research and I found that there are more cases of rehabilitation than there are of young people going off, breaking complete contact and starting new lives. Of course, we do have refugees and we do have girls that are in there and they do have to start lives afresh, but that's in the minority, because at the end of the day, despite it being your parents that are forcing you, you're still their child. And if the effort is made, to mediate, if the effort is made to bring the two parties closer, then most of the time, the parents will think, actually, I will put my child first.
While there may not be a consensus on whether this criminalisation is the right step, most people I asked seem to agree on what the best way forward is. Professor Nick Howe and Freedom Charities, Anita Prem.
I think education. It's about awareness. It's about, so it becomes culturally unacceptable rather than culturally acceptable. And the heart to that rests in the various communities.
Education. We have been told that perpetrators aren't necessarily the parents. The average age of a perpetrator is a male who's 23 years old. So it's the brothers and cousins that are forcing young people into marriage and forcing older people into marriage. And for that reason, we have to deal with education. That's going to be the key thing, and that's what Freedom Charity are doing right now. And I think that's the only way we're going to really tackle this.
Nazir Afzal from the CPS says they're open to suggestions.
We learn every single day, so you tell me, and I wait for the communities, I wait for the public to advise me as to what else needs to be done, what else can be done in order to protect people. All of what we've introduced and are introducing has come from the victims themselves. They told us they wanted a national hotline where people could seek guidance and support. The government funded that. They told us that they wanted specialist prosecutors and specialist police officers. They've got that. They told us they wanted every agency, health, education, etc., to have minimum standards. They have that. They told us that they wanted criminalising forced marriage. The government are in process of making that happen. So it comes from the people who are most involved and who have most knowledge. We don't have all the knowledge. We learn and listen. And when we listen, we learn.
People following me, or still now they follow me. And that was the main reason that I came to the police station. That in the future or anytime, if anything happens to me, it's them.
The audio is from footage that was aired on ITV's Exposure programme. Young Banaz Mahmood predicted her own death in a police interrogation room. The 19-year-old from Surrey was killed in January 2006 because she was seen kissing her boyfriend outside a tube station. In September 2003, 17-year-old Shofilia Ahmed was murdered in Warrington because of refusing to partake in a forced marriage. Lessons have been learned from these cases, says Nazir Afzal.
After Banaz's terrible murder, we brought 5 people to justice for her murder. So 5 people are now in prison for the rest of their lives for killing a 19-year-old girl who simply kissed somebody outside of a tube station. So we've done that. The police issued the Association of Chief Police Officer guidelines for police officers. They never existed before Banaz's murder, which provides all manner of information to officers about what they're dealing with. And similarly, the support structures are in place now for victims and witnesses. So it is not just the police, it's all agencies have improved the level of their service, but not wishing to be complacent because each and every day somebody is being harmed.
Alexander Khan was lucky to have escaped.
I dread what would have happened to me back then. Obviously, we've recently had a case in Warrington of that poor girl that was murdered, and it's terrible that it happens to this day. So back then, I was quite fearful for my life, and that's how I managed to escape from that forced marriage.
But for many others, like Shafilia or Banaz, the decision to enforce their right to choose cost them their lives. The summer vacation is drawing to a close. It remains to be seen how many of these young people will now return from their so-called holidays.